Fair Housing and Commercial Property, Director of Fair Housing and Commercial Property for the Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission. And welcome. Today we're going to be talking about housing justice and domestic violence. We couched it in that phrase. You'll see why. We're going to be talking a little bit about the laws associated with domestic violence and some of the protections that exist, both in state and federal. Okay, so we'll go on to the next slide. The first thing you should all know is that fair housing in Pennsylvania is your right. It is not a law that is designated for one group of people. It is a law that protects everyone through multiple facets of life. All right, next slide, please. I think I have Dominion up. So what are we going to do today? We're going to provide an overview of the Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission. We're going to identify relevant fair housing laws, protected classes, and discriminatory practices. We're also going to discuss how a municipal ordinance can impact those experiencing domestic violence. And we're going to share housing protections under HUD regulations and under the PHRA. And finally, we're going to try and answer your questions as they arise or at the end of our presentation. So who is the PHRC? We have a two-part mission, and the first is to enforce the Pennsylvania non-discriminatory laws like the Pennsylvania Human Relations Act and the Pennsylvania Fair Educational Opportunities Act. And secondly, we promote equal opportunity for all in PA. And Brittany, am I doing this slide? Yeah, I can do it. And so how do we do this? That second goal, we do this through key partnerships. We have Community Relations and Activities Task Force, which is made up of many agencies throughout the state. We have the Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission Advisory Councils. Again, these are groups of volunteers within their communities that know their communities, that keep an eye on situations in their community and call attention to them. And they try to actively work in educating and providing assistance in those communities with our help. We have partnerships with local Human Relations Commission. We are one of the founding organizations within the Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing Task Force, which is made up of, public housing authorities, municipal officials, fair housing enforcement agencies, housing counseling agencies, where we discuss issues of fair housing and issues that are affecting certain groups of the population more so than others. And we discuss solutions of how we can move the needle forward and make sure that people are less affected. And then we also work with various housing advocacy groups as well. We promote equal opportunity through trainings in schools, at employers, community organizations, housing providers, local officials, and all of those are available if you go online at phrc.gov or .pa.gov. This map basically illustrates our jurisdiction. We are all across the state. We have a regional office in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. We have one in Harrisburg, and we have one in Philadelphia. And through those offices, we have investigators in all those offices and legal staff. So we're able to cover the state as cases come in, depending on where they're coming from. So what are some of the non-discriminatory laws? Obviously, we mentioned the Pennsylvania Human Relations Act. We cover employment protections, housing, which we will concentrate on today, commercial property, which is similar to the housing in scope and protection, public accommodations, but that's the ability to enter into public spaces without being discriminated against, primary and secondary education. And then the Pennsylvania Fair Education Opportunities Act covers protections on post-secondary education. And how about the fair housing laws? The Fair Housing Act obviously is one of the laws that we will talk about today, the Section 504 Rehabilitation Act, the American with Disabilities Act, the State Pennsylvania Human Relations Act. And then you should check your local ordinances, because the way that it runs, you'll have your stated protections from the federal code, and then you have perhaps expanded protections, as it is in our case at the state level. And then as you get into the local level, there'll probably be even more protections. And one example I can offer is Philadelphia. Philadelphia has a protected class, which talks about the protected class of source of income. In other words, you cannot be discriminated against because you receive maybe a Section 8 housing voucher, for example. That is not a protection that is offered at the federal level, and it is not a protection that is offered at the state level. And so that's a perfect example where you might want to check your local ordinances to see what protections exist in your area. So what do fair housing laws cover? And let me get this icon out of my way here. They cover the sale, rental of housing and housing related transactions. And some of those transactions include obviously refinancing, getting a loan, an appraisal, anything that has to do with the housing transaction in the sale of it or in the rental of it. And then types of housing that is covered includes apartments, single family homes, mobile home parks, condominiums, public housing, nursing homes, dormitories, and there are some others that are also covered. And many people ask me, well, are Airbnbs covered? And I will give you the legalese answer. It depends, right? On the one hand, an Airbnb can be considered a venture of a commercial nature, and therefore we might look at it as a commercial property and therefore would be covered. It could also be a public accommodation because it's also something where you're allowing the public to come in. So it really depends on the circumstance of that particular case. When we look at discrimination, we look at both disparate treatment, which is a treatment that directly discriminates against a member of a protected class, and we look at it for disparate impact. So that's a policy that impacts members of a protected class. It's a neutral policy, but when put into practice, it affects a member of a protected class. We'll get into a little bit more of that in a bit. So fair housing laws continued. First of all, the Fair Housing Act of 1968 had two goals. I want you to put in the chat if you knew this. Did you know that there were two goals to the Fair Housing Act? That it wasn't just about ending discrimination or investigating or prohibiting discrimination? Just write in the chat if you knew that already. If not, I'm going to go ahead and talk to you about the second goal. But from the inception, there were always two parts of the Fair Housing Act. The first one is to prohibit discrimination, right? To prevent discrimination and to exercise judicial authority against anyone that would break that law. And so the second goal is to promote diverse, inclusive communities, or to desegregate neighborhoods, which is also known as affirmatively furthering fair housing, right? And back in 2015, it was defined. How do you define affirmatively furthering fair housing? Well, it's taking meaningful actions in addition to combating discrimination that overcome patterns of segregation and foster inclusive communities free from barriers that restrict access to opportunity based on a protected characteristic. Okay, so it was in 2015 and we're currently under that definition of affirmatively furthering fair housing. And HUD has provided a new proposed rule, which basically follows the same pattern or the same concept. Let's talk about housing jurisdiction. We're looking at housing that is covered by the Act. Under the Fair Housing Act, housing providers with 4 or more properties, unless they publicly advertise vacancies or receive federal funding, right? 4 or more properties. In Pennsylvania, though, under the Pennsylvania Human Relations Act, housing providers with just 1 property are covered. So we have a more expansive coverage. As far as filing timeline with HUD or with under the Fair Housing Act, you have 365 days from the date of the last harm. Okay, say the harm was an eviction. So 365 days from that date. Whereas in Pennsylvania, you have 180 days from the date of that last harm. Let's talk about protected classes. Under the Fair Housing Act, you'll see there that they cover race, color, national origin, familial status, religion, sex, and disability. Under the Pennsylvania Human Relations Act, we are, again, more expansive. And so we have race and color, national origin, familial status, religious creed, sex, disability, age 40 and above, ancestry, and the use, handling, or training of a support animal for disability purposes. So it gives you an example how it, with the federal, you have one coverage, and then when you get into the state level, you have more expansive coverage, and sure, locally, even more expansive. Let's talk about familial status. What does that mean? Familial status means that there is the presence of children under the age of 18 living with parents or legal custodian, okay? Also covered under this is the pregnant person, right? And people securing custody of children under the age of 18. And foster children are included in that, okay? And let's talk a little bit about the sex as far as a protected class under the Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission. While LGBTQ plus is not considered a protected class under the Pennsylvania Human Relations Act, according to a 2018 guidance from the PHRC, the term sex may refer to sex assigned at birth, sexual orientation, transgender identity, gender transition, gender identity, and or gender expression. And that guidance is available on our website. And you can see the link there, but you can go on our website. So we put that guidance together back in 2018 here. Now, the guidance is utilized by the commission in accepting complaints and conducting investigations and adjudicating the cases. And again, we're taking these on a case-by-case basis. The guidance is not a statute and it's not a regulation, but it is instructive for the commission as we look at the case individually, depending on its merits, and then we make our decisions from there. Now, we did propose a regulatory package that is currently under, it's been accepted by the Independent Regulatory Review Commission. So that's already been accepted. We are waiting for it to be published. There's some other step that needs to happen. And then once it's published in the bulletin, then it becomes effective. But we still take those complaints on a case-by-case basis. Let's talk about discriminatory actions. So what are some of the discriminatory actions? Obviously, discriminatory statements would be one. Any discriminatory inquiry, so somebody comes up and they're searching for a house, and the leasing agent might say to them, well, how many children do you have? What do you need to know that? You can ask how many people will be occupying the unit, but to ask how many children is a direct reference to perhaps a familial status inquiry. Steering, which is the ability to try and persuade someone to live where you want them to live. If you're a leasing agent and you're saying, hey, let me show you this unit. I know you like this unit, but I'm going to show you this unit because there are kids that live close by. There's a playground close by. They all walk up to the school bus together. And that's nice. And it sounds benign on its face. But when you apply it that way, you're removing choice from that individual looking for housing. People have a right to live where they want to live, not where they're steered to live. Another discriminatory action is to refuse to sell, lease, or finance. Unfair appraisals. You've all heard that in the headlines, I'm sure. Discriminating in housing terms and or conditions. Unequal provision of services and facilities sometimes happens in multifamily housing. Sexual harassment, and refusal to provide a reasonable accommodation and modification. Those are some of it. And again, it's not an exhaustive list, but it gives you kind of an idea. Now let's get into domestic violence and fair housing. So why is this important? So some of the facts that you need to know is 112 victims lost their life to domestic violence in Pennsylvania. This number includes 70 females and 42 males. Between 22 and 57% of all homeless women report that domestic violence was the immediate cause of their homelessness. In 2006, the report by the U.S. Conference of Mayors stated that 44% of cities surveyed identified domestic violence as the primary cause of homelessness. The need for safe housing and economic resources to maintain safe housing are the most pressing concerns among abused women who are planning to or have recently left abusers. So for those reasons and more, and again, we didn't get into the Marauder reasons, this becomes increasingly important. Now, it's important to remember also that there is no explicit protection under the Pennsylvania Human Relations Act or the Fair Housing Act for survivors of domestic violence. However, survivors often are discriminated against because of violence committed against them. So we have to look at this again. I mentioned earlier when we look at disparate treatment versus disparate impact. This is one of those situations where the domestic violence survivor may actually be hit with both sides of that coin. They could be treated disparately because of this, or they could be treated, the impact might affect them because of policies that are in place. So when you look at the majority of domestic violence survivors, they're female, and they could qualify as a complainant under the Pennsylvania Human Relations Act or the FHA under the protected category of sex. Remember, sex is a protected category. And because of those national statistics of who suffers or survives domestic violence, that might allow us to look at a case and say, okay, this person may be treated be treated this way because they're female, not because they're a survivor of domestic violence, but because they're female, and under national statistics, that bears looking at because of the impact that they have. Policies and practices that target or otherwise discriminate against women because of their status as a survivor of domestic violence would qualify them as discrimination. So I talked about this. I'm going to define this for you a little bit. Talked about a housing provider may not intentionally discriminate based on protected class in a housing related transaction. That would be disparate treatment. So an example of this is a survivor of domestic violence has the right to appeal an adverse housing decision like an eviction or denial of housing. Okay, so you might say, well, why is that important? Because remember I said that sometimes a survivor of domestic violence may suffer both ends of this spectrum. It may be both treatment and it also may be impact. So hold on to that thought as we move through, and it'll become clear. Here's an example of disparate impact. A policy has a discriminatory effect even if it appears to be neutral. So let's give you this example. During a criminal background check, it may be discovered that the survivor may have an assault charge. However, in many cases, they were defending themselves or others, and in many cases, a child. So when you have a blanket policy or denial of everyone with a criminal background, it has a disparate impact because of the way they limit housing opportunities for survivors of domestic violence. Does that make sense to everyone? So again, we're looking at the fact that there are no explicit protections under the Act, but when we start looking at disparate impact, that's why we would look at that case. So while we talk about disparate treatment and we talk about disparate impact, right? Disparate treatment, just to make it real clear, that would be an example of someone saying, listen, yeah, I heard that you and your man don't get along. There's always fighting. I'm not about to rent to you. That's disparate treatment. You're basically saying because of the protected class, even though you didn't call it out, it's because of that treatment that you're not, or because of the fact that she's a victim or there's domestic violence, you're not giving them a home. And that is something that we would definitely look at as an investigation. Because would that landlord say the same thing if it were a male? So what's a nuisance ordinance? And I thought it was important to talk about that because we need to get into this. A nuisance ordinance is a local law that penalizes housing providers for repeated police activity to the housing unit. So survivors of domestic violence or intimate partner violence may call the police for protection from their abuser. In many cases, after that certain amount of calls, the housing provider may be forced to evict the victim. This could expose the survivor to life-threatening situations for fear of calling law enforcement in order to stay housed. What's that mean? It means that knowing this, a survivor may choose to stay because they want to keep the housing for themselves and the child and their children. And so they would rather face the wrath from their abuser than lose housing because of that ordinance. And this is a perfect example where that ordinance has a disparate impact against an individual that is a survivor of domestic violence. All right. So the Violence Against Women Act, as we talk about that, the Violence Against Women Act is a federal law. In part, provides housing protections for people applying for or living in units subsidized by the federal government and who have experienced domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, or stalking, to help them maintain a safe and reduce their likelihood of experiencing homelessness. It was originally signed into law in 1994, and it has been updated to increase protections multiple times since then. The most recent one was in 2022. So we went from talking about the nuisance ordinances, right, which is what we would look at as the Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission. We would look at that nuisance ordinance and maybe the application of it and how it impacted that survivor. And we would look at that as a disparate impact or a disparate treatment, depending on what the facts of the case are. But now we've transitioned into the VAWA, the Violence Against Women Act, which is a federal protection for housing that is subsidized by federal programs. Okay, so in this case, now we're entering into a world where they are protected, right? So what does this do? It establishes within HUD a gender-based violence prevention office with a VAWA director who will oversee the implementation of the VAWA housing title within HUD in coordination with other federal agencies. That's all a bunch of federal speak that basically means it creates this program to protect survivors of domestic violence. It protects the rights of survivors to report crime emergencies from their homes without fear of punishment or eviction. So you see how it addressed this nuisance ordinance portion of it? It basically stated, okay, yeah, there's a nuisance ordinance, but under this law, because you live in a federally subsidized home, you are protected from being evicted, okay? It expands the current definition of homelessness to reflect accurately the experiences and realities of sexual assault survivors. It provides for VAWA housing related training and technical assistance. And it creates a review process of covered housing providers' compliance with VAWA to improve implementation of the Act's existing protections. So basically, it's a compliance issue. It checks the housing providers to making sure that they are complying with these laws. Now, what housing is covered under VAWA? Well, this one is an extensive list. Obviously, public housing, housing choice voucher, project-based Section 8, Section 8 moderate rehabilitation, single room occupancy, or SROs. Section 202, supportive housing for the elderly. Section 202, direct loans. So you see it's all the transaction associated with federal subsidies. The Section 202 direct loan, the Section 811, supportive housing for persons with disabilities, housing opportunities for persons with AIDS or the HOPWA, home investment partnerships, emergency solutions grants, so that's ESG grants, the continuum of care, Section 221, it has the Section 236 and housing trust funds. So it's an extensive list. And when you start looking at this, it's like, okay, so basically all federal subsidies. And that's basically what they meant to do, okay? Now, how does VAWA protect survivors? Because we've talked about, okay, they've established this, they have compliance, they check on things, they are protected. Well, under this, under the VAWA, someone who has experienced domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, and or stalking cannot be denied admission or assistance under a HUD subsidized unit. They cannot be evicted from a HUD subsidized unit nor have their assistance terminated because of VAWA violence abuse committed against them. They cannot be denied admission or evicted or have their assistance terminated for reasons related to VAWA. They must have the option to stay in their subsidized housing, even if there have been criminal activity directly related to VAWA. So even though they may have gotten a charge against them for assault, it may have been in self-defense, and therefore you can't use that against them. Can request an emergency transfer from the housing provider for safety reasons. And this is one where we still run into some sticky situations where a housing provider, even though they may receive several federal subsidies, if people are not staying up on their training, they may make the mistake and say, well, no, our policy is not to move things, but there is an opportunity for them to actually move them to another unit if it's going to keep them safe. Because that's, at the end of the day, that's what VAWA is about, making sure that someone is safe in their home. So continuing to talk about how VAWA protects survivors, they can't be coerced, intimidated, threatened, or retaliated against by HUD subsidized housing. And they have the right to seek law enforcement and emergency assistance for themselves or others without being penalized by local laws or policies. You see how that addresses the local ordinances? So it directly refutes what's going on with some of the local ordinances, which again, I submit to you may be benign on their face, but when they're applied in this particular case, these people are affected. Let's see here. How does protect survivor? Let's see, it must be able to provide proof to the housing provider by self-certifying. In other words, many cases in those federal housing, you know, when you lose an income, many times that's a reason that used to be used to basically, okay, well, you're not going to be able to afford the apartment, and therefore you got to leave. That policy, though neutral on its face, does have an impact against the domestic violence survivor. So you have to allow them to be able to certify on their own. Must receive HUD's notice of VAWA housing rights. This is part of the compliance end of it. So they should be informed that there are VAWA protections under federal housing subsidies. They have the right to strict confidentiality regarding the information of their status as a survivor. And that confidentiality also goes beyond just what is named there. You can't say to someone else where they're living, especially if they're VAWA and you've just moved them to another unit. You can't be sharing that information. Again, they can request a lease bifurcation. That's another issue that used to be pretty sticky when these issues came around. You had to be able to bifurcate, and in many cases, leasing agents wouldn't allow that. You know, property managers, they wouldn't allow that. So they're able to separate from their spouse in order to stay themselves on the lease by themselves. Let's see here. So if you believe you've been discriminated against in housing, or if you believe somebody's been discriminated in housing, take a look at our contact information there. You can contact the PHRC or the local fair housing agency, and our PA Fair Housing hotline information is there. And you can learn more about filing a fair housing complaint with PHRC. And then we have our intake number there as well. In the same category as domestic abuse. Is domestic violence in the same category as domestic abuse? I would submit yes, right? You have a victim and you have an aggressor, okay? So I would submit yes, and thank you for the question. That was a question from the chat. This is how you can file a complaint with HUD. So if you're working with people that or you yourself are a survivor, and you want to file a complaint, this link, and we'll make sure that we try and share this with everyone, but this link here gets you to the complaint form. And then there's more information about how to file a VAWA complaint. And that's the other site there. And the reason those two are different because one has to do with a generic complaint. The other one is specifically a VAWA complaint form. This is just a list of the information that we have. Where you can get more information. Again, we'll try and share this with everyone. This is also being recorded, so you'll be able to revisit this as well and get some of this information. And this is my information, and there's also a QR code there. And while we go through the Q&A, we have some time here, and I realize that I might have gone. I tried not to go too quick because out of respect for Corey and for Cassandra, but sometimes I get a little faster than I should. But we have a QR code here. If you wouldn't mind scanning that code and taking a real brief survey. This is how we kind of keep our pulse on the community with regards to how our trainings are, the type of information we're sharing, and also what other type of information you'd like to see us touch upon in future trainings. And that's very vital information for us because we try to make these trainings as intuitive as possible. And of course, you have our phone number there, and you also have my contact information there as well. And with that, I will open it up to take questions from everyone, and I'll leave this on the screen. But if you want to come off of mute and fire away some questions, if you don't feel comfortable doing that and you'd rather do it through the chat, feel free to do that. We'll go ahead and open it up for questions. I see we have 23 people in the room. And this is, I know, a lot of technical information. So is there any question regarding, let's see, can a landlord be the aggressor to the victim? I hate to give you the legal answer, but yeah, I mean, I would think it would depend on the circumstances. If you want to expand on your question a little bit there, Andrea, it sounds intriguing to me. And before answering, I would use our legal department's favorite phrase. It depends. Okay? But feel free to expand upon that a little bit because it's interesting to me. Can a landlord be the aggressor to the victim? And what I will say is this: if a landlord, in many cases, has been a sexual predator, then there's no reason to expect that they wouldn't also be a stalker. There's no reason not to believe that they wouldn't also perpetuate. And so in those particular cases, it really does depend on the particular case. I'm assuming this landlord that you may be talking about might be someone that is not affiliated with a subsidized housing unit. And it might be an independent landlord. And I think that would probably be more common in those situations. Yeah, very good question. And so part of it is, it depends. The other part of it is on the surface, yeah, just like landlords are capable of discriminating, just like landlords are capable of sexual harassment, just like landlords are capable of verbal abuse, I would definitely say yes. And the question is, how do we protect the victim? How do we protect that survivor? What actions are taken against that individual? And obviously, you know, if a landlord is an aggressor and a perpetrator, there's obviously the law enforcement protection. Is there an opportunity for filing a complaint? Again, I won't say yes directly because it really depends on the facts of the case and whether or not it's a disparate treatment. And can the facts lay out that if it were a male, they would not act the same way? In many cases, we can look at that. And if that being the case, then yes, that would be one that we would probably look at for a case. Under the federal guidance, again, they would probably look at it in the same way if this landlord is not affiliated in any way with any federal subsidies. Intimidation or threats of eviction, inhumane behavior. Okay, so when we're looking at those kinds of things, intimidation, thank you for expanding, Andrea, I really appreciate that. So intimidation, that is something that is covered under the Fair Housing Act. We you know, not to get into legal speak, but that is Section 818 of the Fair Housing Act, which deals with intimidation and threatening behavior, threats of eviction. And it really depends on what the initial harm was, right? and whether or not that initial harm is associated with a protected class. Okay, so if this, for example, if this individual is female, or this individual is a person of color, or this individual is LGBTQ, or this individual is elderly, or from another nation, and the intimidation, the coercion, the threats of eviction are coming at the heels of interactions that they've had with that landlord and that landlord's attitude towards those protected classes that I mentioned, then certainly you could file a complaint against that individual. Absolutely. Because it's because of that protected class that that person is probably acting the way they are acting, and therefore are intimidating and threatening with eviction. Okay, and definitely the inhumane behavior. I mean, we see that in discriminatory cases. We see that many times. I mean, the very act of discriminating against an individual is to be treated less than human, less than being a person, less than being someone deemed of respect and dignity. So yes, thank you for expanding upon that. I'll entertain any other questions. We have about 15 minutes left. So. And Andrea, I hope that answered your question. All right. If there are no further questions, and again, please, once again, as a favor to me, scan that QR code and take a moment to take that survey, because it's how we put these trainings together. And we could come out here and just do a generic one, but it would not be as impactful or as memorable or easy to retain if it's not intuitive to what you're seeing out there, what you experience out there as you do your work or as you interact with folks. So that's why we ask. I know that you probably fill out a lot of surveys and whatnot, but this is the reason we do it. Aside from the fact that we like to keep track of our trainings and the topics that we cover and the topics that people request. That's really, really important. Okay. If there are no further questions, if no one will come off of mute, I want to thank you for your time and your respect. I hope you found this information helpful. Please feel free to reach out if you need additional information. If you'd like to have us do this type of training with your organization, just reach out to me. You have my information there. If there's nothing further, I want to again thank Cassandra and Corey for their help, as well as our transcriber. And with that, have a great afternoon, and we'll see you next time.